You ever look around and wonder why, in a world that's just brimming with religious belief, real, genuine piety seems so, well, so rare? It's a huge question, right? And the 16th century theologian John Calvin, he tackled this exact problem head on. And you know what? His answer is just as cutting today as it was 500 years ago. So let's dive into his argument. All right, so Calvin kicks things off with this really fascinating premise. He argues that every single one of us, no exceptions, is born with this innate sense of the divine. He actually calls it a seed of religion. Think of it like a basic fundamental awareness that there is a God. It's not something you have to be taught. It's already there, kind of engraved on our hearts from the get-go. But right away, that brings up a huge paradox, doesn't it? I mean, if this divine seed is in everybody, then why isn't the world just blossoming with genuine faith and reverence? Why instead do we see so much that looks like the complete opposite? This is the central puzzle that Calvin is trying to piece together. All right, so let's dig a little deeper into this divine seed idea. For Calvin, this is ground zero. It's the starting point for any knowledge we could possibly have of God. But, and this is a huge but, what he observes is that this built-in potential, well, it almost always gets smothered, or twisted, or corrupted somehow before it ever gets a chance to really grow. And he does not mince words about just how widespread this problem is. Get this, he estimates that you'd be lucky to find even one person in 100 who actually nurtures the seed in their heart. I mean, just think about that. It's a seriously stark and, yeah, pretty pessimistic observation. He's basically saying this problem is universal. And this leads him to a pretty grim conclusion. Because this corruption is so rampant, he says that what usually passes for religion in the world, it's just a pale imitation of the real deal. This is why, in his words, no real piety remains in the world. So what's doing all this damage? Well, Calvin points his finger at three main culprits. First up, the number one corrupting force he calls out is something he calls superstitious pride. And listen, when Calvin says superstition, he's not talking about black cats or walking under ladders. No. For him, it's something way deeper, something totally fundamental to how we operate as human beings. So the definition here is absolutely key. Superstition, in Calvin's world, is what happens when we try to understand God, but we refuse to rise above ourselves. We end up measuring God by our own tiny, flawed standards, by what he bluntly calls our carnal stupidity. So instead of us conforming our lives to God, we try to make God conform to us. And he breaks this down even further. He says it's all rooted in this proud vanity, claiming we know more than we actually do. It's fueled by this vain curiosity that sends us flying off into all kinds of empty speculation instead of doing the hard work of actual investigation. And at the end of the day, it's just this false confidence, this trust in our own flawed ideas about who God is. So what you end up with are two totally different paths. On one side, you've got true knowledge, which conforms to God's will and means rising above yourself. On the other side, you have superstition, which conforms to human whims and, measures God by our own limited perspective. One path is about discovery, the other is really just about invention. And here's the bottom line, the really crucial point. When people go down this road of superstition, they might think they're being religious, they might feel very pious, but according to Calvin, they're not actually worshiping God at all. They're just worshiping a projection of themselves, what he calls a figment and a dream of their own heart. All right, that brings us to the second corrupting force. This one kind of builds on the first, but it's much more active, more deliberate. Calvin calls it willful denial. Now, we're not just talking about ignorance or making a mistake here. Calvin is describing a conscious choice. This is when people actively try to snuff out that light of nature, that innate seed of religion. They deliberately shove away any memory of God. And, in his words, they choose to befuddle themselves. He actually maps it out as this kind of downward spiral. So it starts when someone gets hardened in their sin. Then, from there, they start to actively push away any thought of God. The next step, they mentally strip God of his power, his judgment, his authority. And the end result of all this is that they fashion for themselves a dead and empty idol. Now, this is a super important point. Calvin is not talking about atheism here. It's not that these people deny God's existence. No, what they deny is his relevance. They, as he puts it, shut him up, idol in heaven. It's like they're saying, sure, God, you can exist way up there, but you have no power, no authority, and definitely no say in my life down here. And that brings us to the third and final corruption Calvin identifies. And this one might be the most sneaky of all, because on the outside it can look a lot like the real thing. He calls it empty hypocrisy. So when Calvin talks about a hypocrite, he doesn't just mean someone who fails to live up to their beliefs. We all do that. He's talking about someone whose entire religious performance is driven by the absolute wrong motive. They're not acting out of love or reverence for God. They're acting out of what he calls a slavish, forced fear of being judged, a judgment they secretly just want to escape so they can keep doing whatever they want. So what does that actually look like in the real world? Well, the hypocrite just goes through the motions. They perform all these little religious duties, what Calvin calls paltry sacrifices and worthless little observances, to try and placate God, to kind of buy him off. But the whole time, they just keep polluting themselves with vice, trusting that their little rituals will cover for them. They're trying so hard to seem close to the very God they're actually fleeing from. And Calvin's take on this is just brutal. He says this isn't even a real shadow of religion. It's a vain and false shadow. Something so empty it's scarcely even worth being called a shadow. I mean, wow. It has all the outer appearances of religion, but absolutely none of the inner substance. So, where does that leave us? Well, Calvin's laid out these three major ways that we manage to corrupt that innate knowledge of God we're all born with: superstitious pride, willful denial, and empty hypocrisy. And here's maybe the biggest takeaway. In spite of all this corruption, Calvin insists that the original seed can't be completely torn out by the roots. That sense of the divine is still in there, buried deep down. The real tragedy, though, is that it gets so twisted and smothered that it's never allowed to grow properly. In fact, his final verdict is that the corruption is so complete that this seed, when it's just left on its own in the human heart, actually produces the opposite of what it was supposed to. Left to itself, he says, it produces only the worst fruits. But then, he adds one last fascinating little observation. The proof that this seed is still there, he argues, is that when things get really bad, in moments of pure desperation or crisis, even the most hardened person, the one who denies it all, will cry out to God. That buried knowledge just forces its way to the surface when every other defense has crumbled. And all of this leaves us with a pretty provocative thought, doesn't it? I mean, Calvin was writing about his world 500 years ago, but these patterns he's describing, measuring God by our own standards, making God irrelevant, or just going through the empty motions of faith, gosh, that feels incredibly modern. So the question for us right now is, where do we see these exact same patterns, superstition, denial, and hypocrisy, playing out in the world today?